Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Sam TV podcast. I have a very special bonus episode. Sort of kind of needed to do this because this week, 8 years ago, we had the Napa Valley earthquake. And if you're familiar with Sam Into the Bottle, it's the first big chapter was the vintage, and we really used something pretty big to kick that off, which was the earthquake itself. So today, I'm going to be joined for the very first time on the podcast with my business partner, my best friend in the world. His name is Jackson Myers, and he's a cinematographer, editor, co-producer on everything I have ever really done, and really great guy. So you want to stay tuned to that because we had to drive up out of nowhere to cover this earthquake with no plans and no place to shoot. And it was really one of the most chaotic, crazy things in filmmaking and also clearly in winemaking that region had ever experienced. And at the end of this podcast, I'm going to put an excerpt of my conversation with Steve Mathiasen that I did the day of the earthquake when he was, or it might have been like just right after the earthquake, where he was very frazzled and dealing with some big personal issues and such. So stay tuned after my conversation with Jackson for that. And just to let you know, next week, on next week's podcast and going to Sam TV, I have a conversation with NBA player CJ McCollum about his wine he grows in Oregon, life, and much more. So you'll want to make sure you tune in next week for that. And without further ado, my bonus podcast with Jackson. Jackson, how do you feel about being on the Sam TV podcast? This is really big for you.
Well, it's a long time coming, Jason. Thanks for finally having me on after 15 years of working with you.
Listen, I think here's my biggest fear. Your voice is like silk. It's beautiful. It's kind of like if Barry Manilow and Morgan Freeman and Aretha Franklin and who's that guy that's married to Machine Gun Kelly. If all those guys were mixed together, that's like what your voice sounds like, and I was afraid I'd be out of a job.
Except that I have no tune. So if they could all sing out of tune like me, then yeah, that's about right.
I would say that for sure your voice sounds auto-tuned automatically. I don't want to get too deep into this stuff. The reason you're on
Why am I on? Can you refresh me why I'm on this podcast finally?
You're on this podcast because we did something we were younger then, 8 years ago. It feels like that's been 2 lifetimes. We were making a sequel to our film, Sam, you and I. I don't know why we were doing that in retrospect. That was a little ballsy, I think. And we were still trying to figure out how to make the structure work. And I remember being woken up in the middle of the night by a bunch of calls from people up in the Napa area and that an earthquake had hit. And somebody sent me a photo from inside. I could be getting this wrong, but I believe it was Silver Oak. And there were a bunch of bottles all over in the floor. And so I immediately called this person and I said, we want to come up and film at Silver Oak. And they said, no effing way are we going to let you come into our place and see all these bottles. My next call was to you.
I remember this.
Yeah, so this was virtually the middle of the night. And I called you and I said, Jackson,
you woke me up.
What do we have in the realm of cameras or cameras we can get a hold of? And we were shooting, just really quick geek moment. We were shooting Sam 2 on one of the early kind of Sony cinema cameras. That was 4K. Yeah, prototype. And so it was hard to, get a camera of that quality, but we were able to get it. And I somehow convinced you without any plan, any place to shoot, anywhere to go that would let us film to jump in a car, basically steal a camera from a rental house and drive up to Napa and figure out what the hell we were going to do on the way. So I just want to ask, let me shut up and ask you, what do you remember of this day, of just the beginning of it?
It wasn't the first time you've asked me for something this spontaneous, but I will say it was probably the first time you woke me up and said, we got to go in a couple hours. What can we pull together? How can we make it happen? There's this earthquake. It's very tragic. We got to get up there. We got to talk to people, figure out where we could go. I remember that like yesterday. Yeah.
This is probably the only time I've ever done that to you.
To that extreme, that's probably true, but only to that extreme. You've done similar things. But I remember, I don't think I had to think very hard about it, obviously. I mean, we're in the midst of making this movie. This was like an incredibly tragic event that happened. And it now, in hindsight, connected us to people we're so close with and who have been such important parts to our films. I mean, the Merediths, like right? It's like Carol and Steve.
Yep.
And Steve Mathiasen. Yeah.
Carol Meredith, Steve Mathiasen, Steve Mathiasen's wife, Jill. I mean, they're to say they're important is an understatement. I think I remember being in that car with you. We were very tired. You were driving. We had a a buttload of gear that I swear we only got because of the confusion we threw the rental house into. Like, it was like, you don't understand. This is this is so important and it's going to change the world. And we just blah, blah, blah. And then we just found ourselves on the road with this gear. And I think the people at the rental house were scratching their head like, what did we just let them take out of
Yeah, that's right.
out of our equipment?
You're good at convincing. Yeah.
So we're driving up the 5, which is the fastest way from Los Angeles up to Napa. And I'm calling everybody I possibly can, everyone I can. And I'm also, I'm like surveying Twitter, which was really at an early stage compared to where it is now. I'm texting everyone I know who's up early working wine. And I want to get one thing just straight out. Nobody died in this earthquake. And I think that if it had happened not in the middle of the night, I mean, Steve Mathiasen says this, a lot of people would have been very, very, very hurt. And I'm grateful that we can speak about this event as a really fun event and something that we remember, but it was traumatic for people. So I don't want to overstate that this was a tough, or understate at least, that this was a very tough event. I got this whiff that Sutter Home up in Napa on the 29, the famous Sutter Home behind White Zin. I have an amazing podcast with Steve Mathiasen coming up where we break down the whole history of White Zinfandel, which is going to be fantastic. And they're a big part of it. They had some issues in their barrel room, barrels everywhere. And you were sort of starting to see these pictures come out that looked like hell in barrel rooms. And I was just like, I can't even believe that this is happening. So I called Sutter Home and I got greeted by a lot of chaotic people. And they said, oh, we love the Somm movie. And I said, well, that's a coincidence because I'm shooting another Somm movie right now. And I'd like to put your story in it. And I think if you know the Somm films, you wouldn't exactly pick Sutter Home as like one of the wines we would cover, but this story would have been truly amazing. And they, like every winery we called, I don't know if this is a Napa thing, but they just didn't want anybody to see anything bad. It's like, we can't show this because whereas I look at wine, it's like, wine's about war, wine's about tragedy, wine's about love, wine's about good stuff. And I don't know. And I think it was hours into our drive. We probably drove 3 hours at 85 miles an hour, 90 miles an hour before anybody would actually entertain the idea of letting us in somewhere. Do you kind of remember this?
That's right. I do. Yeah. We were having a hard time getting people to let us in because they were afraid of showing the carnage, I think. They didn't want people to know that they lost all this wine, maybe. I don't know if that's what it was. Maybe it was just so intense in the moment that they just couldn't deal with managing us getting into their lives. I don't know.
As we learned later that there was some like dangerous to have people in these places, barrels were falling down. So I had a friend named Michael Villas and one of my best friends, who you know very well, Nico Florea, is a Romanian guy, and they were making wine via a guy named Steve Mathiasen. Now, I had filmed with Steve for an educational video previously. So it's not that I didn't know him, but I wouldn't have called him my friend, And so they said Steve was devastated. His wines were devastated in this, and all his Chardonnay barrels were in barrel, or all the wines were in barrel, and all this blah, blah, blah. And so I called him, and I can't believe he answered. I called him from the 5. We were up, wherever the hell, it's like no man's land with the windmills on the 5. Or was it the 5 or the whatever? Yeah,
no,
580.
Right at the 580. Yeah.
Okay. So, and he said 3 things. He said, 1, this story needs to be told. I'm never going to sleep again. My life's in disarray. My wife will kill me if she finds out that I said yes, but yes, you need to come up here. And if we can get you into where my barrels are, it was Napa Barrel Care. Is that right?
Yeah. That's exactly right.
So like a warehouse with all these barrels.
It's almost like a co-op, right? Where a bunch of different winemakers had their barrels there.
Right. Because that's really the time, though I had met Carol Meredith in some capacity, I didn't know her. And Carol also had her wine sort of slightly devastated there and problems and such. And we'll get to how our meeting with Carol went when we were there. Do you remember when we rolled up on this place? Describe the scene. What was Napa Barrel Care like early in the morning after the earthquake?
Well, it's like a big warehouse, right? So we rolled up. It's a big parking lot, asphalt, and then just this warehouse with some huge, open doors. So from the outside, you couldn't really tell what was going on inside. I remember being like, well, this might not photograph well because it's just sort of a big old warehouse.
Right.
It didn't have character on the outside. But then, I just remember the second we stepped inside, it was like a river of red wine all over. It smelled so intensely like that wine, and the barrels were just everywhere, strewn out across the entire building. Some of them were broken. There were broken bottles all over too. I remember it was a real serious scene. Like, it's surreal. I remember thinking how surreal this was. Yeah.
I'm trying to think if now look, we have a film coming out where we filmed during a war, we filmed in the Vatican, we filmed in a country I'm not allowed to talk about yet, but there are things that happened getting us into Napa Barrel Care that I put on some of the top, how the hell did we pull this off access?
Yeah.
It was a dangerous place. I remember they were.
Oh, yeah. There's a forklift in there, remember? Like trying to move barrels that they could possibly save.
They had like a sky hook or whatever you call those things. Like it was like one of the
Yeah.
high,
Yeah.
I forget what those things are called, but it was pulling with the chain, trying to lift the barrels from top down. But the barrels were broken. There was wine pouring everywhere. Some barrels were intact. Most were smashed. And I just remember there was this one moment where you and we were told, stay on the periphery. It was just you and I, so we had no sound guy. I mean, most of our first two films, sadly, were shot with just you and I as like a main crew. But when we were in there, the owner came up to us, and obviously, if we had not made Sam, that would not have been possible. He was like, I'm a fan, and he was more like, I just want to see what the hell you're going to do with this story. What's going to happen? And I remember him saying, be safe. And like, he walks away back into his office. The guy looked like he had been, through the ringer. He was very tired. Everybody there was really, really, really stressed. And remember that giant mountain of barrels just collapsed and fell all over the place. Like, I mean, stuff was happening on a regular basis that could have killed somebody in this room.
Yeah. I do remember that.
You were standing there.
We didn't have hard hats on.
No, we did not.
Too.
And I also remember that the camera we were shooting with, this is not a tiny camera. You have a very big tripod. You have a cinema camera with a very large lens. This was the real, like, if something were to happen, you'd have to run from the camera and it's going down. It's not like, this is not like YouTube influencer type gear. This was the real thing. So, okay. So then, do you remember Carol Meredith, who is now obviously a major character in that film? She's got the eponymous bullshit line at the top of the bottle. And she's one of my favorite humans. She's the premiere episode of Vertical season 1, her and her husband. But do you remember what she came up and said to us when she saw us filming in there?
You got to refresh my memory. Your memory is better than mine, but I do remember her not necessarily being happy that we were there.
She fucking threw us out.
Yeah.
She came up and she's like, you got to get out of here. You get out of here. It's not safe. You shouldn't be showing this. She came at us.
Yeah.
And I was it's the first moment I realized Carol Meredith is no joke. And I will love this woman until the day I die. I just fell in love with her in that moment. She's like this incredibly intelligent force of nature. And she threw us out. We had to get the owner to go up to her.
Yeah, if I remember right, we didn't leave, right?
No,
but she did try to throw us out. Yeah.
And she of course not. And then so anyways, the process of being in that room, I think, was one that I don't know that anybody else really filmed or documented that event. Now, not to get ahead of ourselves, but we have a film coming up called Ghost of Spring Mountain, which I think, aside from being what I believe is a pretty wild ghost story about wine, and you and I just got back from set on filming some of the last stuff for that movie, but it also deals with the glass fire, which raged through Napa while we were in the middle of shooting this. So it was kind of did you feel like a deja vu situation? We'll talk more about this when the film's released, but did you feel something here?
Definitely. I mean, I just think that it's, we don't live up there, but when you're up there, when something like that happens, you know that the livelihood of all these people's at stake, whether or not their lives are at stake. Like you said earlier, fortunately, this earthquake didn't kill anybody, but it did a lot of damage to people's lives. And so you feel that weight, and similarly with the glass fire. I mean, we were up there when it started, and that was maybe a little bit even more intense since, for the earthquake, we drove up right after it happened. So yeah. Oh my God.
For the glass fire, we were evacuated out of the ground zero.
Yeah, that's a whole nother story. Do we want to get into that?
No,
that's for another time.
We'll get into that when it comes to this film, but I just wondered if you had like any PTSD in regards to how to film. It's almost like we're like storm chasers or something. It's like you don't mean to do
but you
that.
Want to do it respectfully, right? It's I think there is definitely a parallel there between the fire and the earthquake, and it's you want to capture it, you want to do it respectfully, you want to make sure it's documented, not like a newscast. And there's some PTSD there for sure. Cause and it's also like, Carol, obviously she was mad at us for being there because she didn't know what our intentions were, right? At the time when she tried to kick us out. She didn't know us then. And so I can understand that perspective of, outsiders coming in trying to capture something that's, fascinating visually, also really tragic for the people involved in it. But, I think once she realized that our intentions were not to exploit it, it became a different story.
Well, I think also too, there's this element of, okay, everybody acts like social media just always existed, that it's like everybody just wanted to use stuff to get clicks or likes or whatever. But people forget that local news was always like that. Local news was like, hey, look, 5 dogs got into a car and did something. You got to be there right at the moment. You got to be the first one to break the news. And so I think that social media was really exploding when this Napa thing happened. I just think Napa was really nervous of making it look like Napa was falling apart, or that there's this weird sense in it.
I mean, you can attest to, there's parallels with the glass fire in that too.
For sure.
There's a PR element to it where people are afraid that, they will only see the bad and not understand that they're likely going to persevere.
Well, the earthquake is so different than a fire in that, and we've covered this on the podcast, we've covered this on our content on Some TV. I mean, you and I have ad nauseum filmed people going, does fire affect grapes? How does it affect grapes? What's the thing? What's the skins? How does it? But this is very different. An earthquake is it's very physical. There's not much chemical to it. Did it break? Did it bust? Is there air exposed to the wine? I mean, it's not like you don't have to get into the the permeability of grape skins and smoke when it comes to an earthquake. So that's why, look, there's a lot of stuff when you make a documentary or a film or anything, if it even gets finished, you're lucky. And if it even gets seen by one person, you're lucky. And then if it ends up being something like Into the Bottle was on Netflix, renewed 2 times, and now it's on Hulu and it's of course on Top TV. And for a movie to have that happen, it's a lot of luck, a lot of luck. I think it would have been easy to start that movie by talking about the vintage, by showing frost, but who else
have
an earthquake? An earthquake starts the goddamn movie. So
and that's another good example of just something you can't plan for when making a movie, right? I mean, I know you had an idea of the stories you wanted to tell, the topics you wanted to get into, the hardships, the trials and tribulations of making wine and drinking wine and how they're connected. But you didn't go into making Into the Bottle saying, I want to film an earthquake that destroys and devastates a community,
No, God, no.
But then you found the story, you found these amazing people who tell the story in the movie. And to me, it's definitely one of the most poignant scenes.
I agree. Well, it's a great way to start the film, to show how kind of up and down it is. And, now obviously, like you said at the beginning of this, that Steve and Carol and these people are now some of our best friends and our closest. It's not just, these are people that are just I couldn't imagine my life without them, kind of. It's a very, very, very incredible relationship that I have because they've grown while we've grown, and we've sort of come up in the same. I mean, Steven, look, these are much more talented people than I am, but we've come up in the same class. Is kind of what I mean. Is it feels like we've all been a part of a longer journey and went to school with each other or something. And I've obviously had Steve share his thoughts on this. We're in a minute here we'll cut to my interview with Steve that happened the day after the earthquake. That's in the film, maybe a little bit of an extended version of this conversation. But I think
was emotional. That was an emotional interview. Yeah, because I was just right in the thick of it. I mean, it was hours prior, right? The earthquake had happened, and it had taken I don't want to give away anything, but I mean, hopefully you guys have seen Into the Bottle, but it took his house off.
If you're spoiling that film on this podcast, then that's
something's wrong.
Yeah.
But I mean, I just remember he was so, rattled by it, of course. That was intense.
I mean, look, I'm married, you're married, and you know that when life is really upside down, your spouse is and you do something do an interview for a film while you're supposed to be securing safety and finding out are the gas lines turned off and stuff that is just not that. It's kind of interesting to because I do know that Jill has told me, Steve's wife Jill has told me privately and on camera and in front of others, she was very mad at Steve for doing this interview because there was a lot going on. It was very scary. And then, of course, Steve, much like me, is somebody who's impulsive. You fly 5 feet off the ground at all times. And I think in the end, of course, it was a great decision for them because it helped Matthias and Wine be known. Matthias and Wine is fantastic. They don't need us, but we helped is what I guess what I'm trying to say. It's just a help, a push in the direction of people knowing that name, but they would have eventually. It was just a quicker push. Do you think, I just, the last couple things I want to ask you, remember we did Verticals, the season premiere Verticals with Carol Meredith and her husband, Steve Lagier.
Yeah.
And he invented the locking device that goes
right. That keeps the barrels
right on the stack. So when you stack barrels, the biggest problem with why this happened was structurally they just fall. I mean, those stacking things are made relatively cheaply. They are not connected to each other, and so he invented a sort of vice grip that goes between all of the different stacker. This is, I hope, like Megan Zobak or somebody's listening to this. The stackers of wine.
It's a technical term,
right? But he didn't patent it. He put it out there for free. And he said, everybody's got to have this. And so like, he didn't try to make any money. He built it based on the trauma that they went through, the wine they lost, the money they lost. I think he would be very upset to admit that most people are not using these things. I mean,
I'm sure that's right. Yeah.
Now, every time you are walking in these places, these wines, these cellars, do you think about the fact that at any second you could be buried in barrels because it's, I wonder.
I try not to think about that. No, I mean, I can see now that you mention it, I will every time we go into a barrel room. I'm going to think about how I could die in a moment's time, but no,
don't do that. I'm not trying to give you therapy needs,
but when we're in there, I mean, we're so focused on the story at hand. We don't have time to think about how we could be dead in a second's time because people didn't use Steve's system of locking the barrels. No, starting now, we will.
Yeah. Well, don't just this last comment. Do you remember we did Ridge Vineyards in Vertical Season 1? We did 2 episodes on SOM TV, and part of it's like we're right on the San Andreas Fault. Ridge Vineyards sits on the San Andreas Fault, like literally sits on it. And I remember you and I turned to each other after that interview where Paul Draper is just like, yeah, we're right on one of the biggest faults in the world. Most earthquakes originate here, blah, 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 blah. And you and I looked at each other and we're like, should we go shoot the barrel room?
Yeah. And we did.
Of course we did. It's one of my favorite things we've ever shot, but it definitely was, let's protect Paul Draper at all costs.
All costs. The legend.
Oh, anyways, I just wanted to have a quick, spontaneous conversation with you about your memories of doing this.
Well, thanks for, my memories are so good. So you got the right person on. But seriously, thanks for having me on the podcast finally. It took long enough.
Yeah, well, I think our audience has been screaming to talk about focal lengths and circle of confusion. Next time. Antique coatings on different lenses from German lens companies. And so when we're ready for a real cinematographer's podcast, reach out to us, guys.
Find somebody else. Yeah.
No, you're the guy. No way.
Bring it on, man. That's what I want to do.
I love it. Well,
to talk to you about that.
Anybody who has memories,
like we don't every day.
Every day we talk about lenses. It actually is a deep love. Anybody who remembers going through the Napa earthquake, or maybe you just witnessed it through the film Into the Bottle, queue up that film on SOM TV or it's on Hulu as well, and have a glass and cheers to the Mathiasons and Carol Meredith and her husband Steve and everyone else who dealt with this really tragic pain in the ass event. And remember that happened. Without further ado, I'm going to speak with Steve Matthiason right now about from the day it happened, from the film. For some context, this was about 18 or so hours after the earthquake. Steve's pretty shaken up here, so this is about as raw of an interview as you can get about how it felt to go through that. This was in Napa in 2014 for SOM Into the Bottle, the raw interview. Steve, I want you to, I know we're in a tough place here, but I want you to talk to me about what's happening. Talk to me about the earthquake the best you can and kind of what we're dealing with right now.
Okay, so earthquake. Let me think about this for a second. So this earthquake, so the earthquake we have, 2014 vintage in Napa. This is, 2011 we had this rain during harvest that was warm all day. I was sitting in the rain in my truck with my air conditioner on, sweating and all day thinking, this is bad, this is really bad. And 2 days later, poof, the mold starts growing. So, I mean, so now 2014, we have, an earthquake. We have like amazing weather. And the classic thing of California earthquake weather is when it's really mild and beautiful and still, and everyone's like, oh, it's earthquake weather. It's like, so it was like the nicest weather we've had during harvest in I don't know how long. Great year. We got dodged the drought bullet. We got spring rains. Everything's lined up perfectly. We get an earthquake. And so the weird thing is, it doesn't affect this vintage really for us personally because we still have a place to process, luckily. But but our 2013s from last year now all got dumped onto the ground. The barrels did, and some of them I don't know yet whether some are going to be any good or not. But it feels like another natural calamity, but it's a new one for me. Like, earlier this year there was the hail in Burgundy, and I felt so bad for these people. I can't even imagine. I was like, how do you even deal with having half your crop wiped out in like 20 minutes? Especially they had hail last year. That's really brutal because the first thing that comes to your mind is, yeah, you're gonna hurt. You're gonna hurt for the money, but we're on a pretty good roll right now with our brand, and I want to have wine out there in the market for people to taste. People read about us and hear about us, but they need to be able to try the wines, and so we need wine, and so that's the fear, is this lack of wine. But I know it's not a complete wipeout, and it's kind of like, what if you're into natural? I mean, we're grape growers. We grow our own grapes in almost all cases with our wine, and so every single day, I wake up in the morning, check the weather anyways, and figure out it's like Mother Nature deals you a hand of cards every day, and you play it. It's kind of how I look at it, and that's one of the things I really love about it. I just absolutely love the daily challenge and the daily dance, I guess, with Mother Nature. And okay, what are you going to do? It's like the perfect sparring partner or something like that. I mean, I'll never figure her out. You can't, you just have to, you're always stimulated and challenged. And so the earthquake was like, I've been kind of manic even like the last 2 days since the earthquake. Like, it's, for some reason I would have thought in the abstract, like, oh, earthquake knocks all our barrels down. Because, you look at barrels, you think about earthquakes. I mean, it runs through your mind a lot. What if we got an earthquake? These barrels are going to fall down. I would have thought in the abstract I'd be crying in my beer, and instead it's like mixed martial arts when the guy puts on a really good fight and the guy's like hugging and going, "I love you." You just you gave me such a good fight, kind of thing. Like, man, she really got me this time. It's like that was a good one right there.
So, what's the situation like right now, like this moment?
So we're still picking up. I mean, we're literally picking up the pieces because the pieces are all over the ground right now. Our house came off the foundation, chimneys fell down, all their bunch of stuff busted up. I mean, it's like heavy, definitely heavy. Winemaking is relentless. Harvest is going to come when it's going to come, and you need to be ready for it, and you need to deal with it and bring the fruit in. And the logistics are, mind-numbingly complex, and everything goes wrong. And that's a good harvest, right? That's part of being a winemaker is this fall grapes are going to be ready. In the winter they have to be pruned. In the summer they have to be sprayed for powdery mildew, and the rains and those sort of things come, and you have to. You don't. Oh, gee, I'm going to go on vacation. You just schedule this. No, it rained. You're getting out there and spraying. You just are, and so that's how we live, and that's how, and so it's a certain personality that enjoys that. So we're already used to the. That's what wine is about: rising to challenges and overcoming adversity. And it's always just a miracle that this stuff actually gets made and gets into the bottle. There's so many pitfalls along the way, and then you hear about like Chateau Moussard, right? Sergei Hoch, like the stuff he's dealt with war and bringing harvests in, or in Europe. I mean, I remember being in one of the vineyards in Echezeaux and looking at this stucco wall, and right in the head where they keep their tools, and at head level there are bullet holes in the plaster. And I'm going, oh my God, this is, they never filled those bullet holes that, Maybe if someone was hunting, but I don't think so. I think that they were right at head level bullet holes. And so, and they had to make wine. What are you going to do? Not harvest the grapes? You have to make the wine, I mean, you live on that for an entire year. And so when the vintage comes, you pick it. And so the earthquake is just that's a new one. I think it's kind of cool that, there's been plenty of wars and hails and stuff, and they're brutal. But it's the first time I've heard of an earthquake screwing you up during harvest. So at least we have, a good story to tell the grandkids on this one. So again, it's for some reason, even though our house is totally screwed and we probably lost a ton of wine, it's kind of exciting in a weird masochistic way. Like, all right, but, we got Mother Nature was creative this year. This was a first. Maybe this is our California. We don't tend to get the rains. The high pressure dome knocks all the weather north of us. So, but we get this uniquely Californian vintage disaster.
Steve, walk me through exactly how this went down and kind of like what it was like for you to experience this firsthand. Like, how did it happen?
Yeah. So when we got up we were woken up at 3:20 in the morning with the earthquake. Make sure the family is okay. Ran outside, turn off the gas, all the earthquake stuff. Turn off the neighbor's gas, and then try to take stock of what was going on. The first thing I'm thinking is I got to find out what's going on with our barrels. I know they're down. It was a violent earthquake. So I was at the winery by probably 4:00 in the morning, and the manager and the resident winemaker there are, because we rent space out, and so there's a staff winemaker. They're there already as well, trying to figure out what's going on. The lights are on. Tanks are cattywampus. I run down to the barrel room, open the door, and I'm staring at what's normally is a door into the barrel room, and staring at all these topsy-turvy barrels that almost came tumbling out of the door on me. And the manager running, screaming, "Close the door! You don't go in there!" So run outside and go back into the tasting room, which just has a window that looks down onto the cellar, and all the barrels that are normally stacked up are all just tossed around in there like a mad giant just went in there and had a temper tantrum. I mean, it was just nuts. And then and you just go, well, I didn't even know how we're gonna, how do you even extricate them without safely? With that's even if because you want to try to save the wine. But how are we going to save the wine without someone getting hurt? And it was just, absolutely overwhelming. Like, where in the hell do you start? And then come back to the house and then start surveying everything dumped on the ground and smithereens. The place, we have a lot of wine in the house. I mean, the place smelled like the gnarliest bar at 3:00 in the morning. Just all this booze mixed with splattered food and everything. And so it's like, well, let's start picking stuff up.
What effect do you think this is going to have on Napa? Is this going to give a different perspective? Was it all of Napa that got hit here?
Well, it was the worst damage was isolated to a small portion of Napa. So a lot of folks lost libraries or lost, glassware and wine in the tasting rooms, but it was only a small percentage of the cellars, I believe, that had their barrels all come down. And so the Napa Valley at large is, this is no big deal. But, for the people that hit, it's going to be, I hope everyone stays in business, it's going to be tough. The one advantage that the old world producers have is that in many cases, their land is already paid for. Their cellars already paid for. They're not carrying a lot of debt necessarily. And so it's more of a cash flow issue. And what am I going to live on for the next 12 months when they lose their crop, which is no small matter. But again, back to our young industry of California, most wineries still feel like they're in startup mode unless they're more than 10, 15, 20 years old. Even then, they carry a lot of debt. It's a little bit of a different story to weather losing a vintage. It could really put you out in a kind of a uniquely new world way. We're all sort of like starting a winery here is like an internet startup. You're just all in. You're working a lot. Not that they're not working a lot throughout the world, but it's, we're very consciously in this building startup kind of thing where we don't have reserves. And so so I just hope everyone stays in business on this one.
Well, strangely, this is sort of now the story of this vintage. I mean, if you think about it, this is the story, right? This is what it's going to get marked by. What do you think the legacy of this is, Steve?
So the 2013 vintage is going to be. There's always a special vintage. Every wine region, every winery has certain vintages where calamities happen and not very much wine got made. And part of the joy and passion and fun of wine is getting an opportunity to try special things that are so rare and elusive and I mean it's just a lot of fun, like digging into the wine, digging in and experiencing, and so I mean people love verticals, we love different regions, and so the 2013 is always going to carry a special signifier now along with it, that this is the earthquake vintage and there wasn't as much of it for the producers that lost wine, and I think it's going to be a pretty neat little legacy of this vintage going forward. It's never going to, I mean, 50 years from now, it's going to be, that was the earthquake vintage. And it's, so we're making some history. It's not, some people might say that's not very big or special or big deal or whatever, but in the wine world, we're not out there, operating on people or doing international relations. We're doing wine, and because maybe we're shallow and have don't have aspirations that are bigger than, hedonism. But in our world, that's a pretty cool thing is to have it. Now this vintage is always going to be marked in that way. I think it's pretty cool.
Thanks everybody for joining. I hope you subscribe to Sound TV. Remember, it's $49.99 for an entire year or $5.99 a month. Everything's up there for you, education, entertainment. We really appreciate you joining, and be safe.